Warm welcome to our second New Normal audiocast. Today we focus on digitisation. As discussed in our previous audio session, we're living through a period of unprecedented change. As we know, the consumer landscape has changed fundamentally. Businesses across the retail, food, beverage and leisure industries have to adapt to thrive and survive. And organisations require new approaches and solutions to manage the opportunities and risks created by the new normal. So a new feature of the new normal is the rapid and ever-expanding shift to digitisation. I'm sure we'll all agree that the online trend will really continue at an unprecedented pace, as will investments in Industry 4.0 and all things automation. I think it's easy to become fixated with data breach risks arising out of these changes, but I really do continue to beat the drum regarding the increased risks created by business process automation. It's a huge risk exposure and one that I think is really often overlooked. So these changes present many opportunities and challenges for businesses across the retail, food, beverage, leisure industries as they invest in the new digital normal. I'm delighted today to welcome Brian Warzona to discuss the implications these changes have on your cyber landscape and exposures. Now, Brian brings a wealth of cyber insurance and digital risk expertise to our audio series. So, welcome, Brian. First question to you. And what do you see as the largest cyber risks to retail, food, beverage and leisure industry organisations right now?
Well, thank you for having me, David. And it's an interesting question because if we were to look at what was actually the largest exposure about 6, 7, or 8 months ago, I might have said the human capital side of things was the main driver behind everything that's going on. What we've seen is the latest threat due to what's going on with COVID and switching over to this more digitized world is we're actually seeing ransomware as the largest trend. And while this might have been around for the last, say, 3, 4, 5 years, it's become a different type of global pandemic that's affecting many organizations, with the idea that we've seen previously Bitcoin, 1 Bitcoin or 2 Bitcoin being the ransom demand. Now we're seeing into the 8 figures in some cases across the world in terms of the demand that's actually causing this threat. So the combination behind the human capital or the human interaction with the digital world, as well as this ransomware that's going around and this malware that's being implemented on a large scale basis, is creating this huge threat for organizations, particularly in the retail, food and beverage and leisure side of industry. So in addition to that, we're seeing this affect different types of organizations from the supply chain. So it's not just the organization itself, but those that they rely upon that's creating a huge exposure from this digitization.
Yeah, I've really countenanced that. I think a couple of years ago, we were all looking at data breach and the risks around that. But investment in automation really has changed that risk profile. And my sense is that we really do need to be discussing with businesses right now how that cyber exposure regarding automation is changing. And it's a real shift away from probably fixating on sort of property and other risks. I think cyber and digital risk arising out of automation is probably one of the biggest risks facing industries right now. So yeah, next one, Brian, just thinking, how is the cyber market changing to kind of adapt to this new landscape?
Yeah, this is a fun question now, in particular, as we start to ramp up near the end of the year with reinsurance treaties starting, the conversations and negotiations ongoing. In the last 3 months, as I mentioned, the severity of ransomware has actually changed and shifted the entire cyber market from this perspective. So when we look at what was previously being, as you mentioned, and when you were starting to talk about the privacy breach not being the only thing that we should be concerned about, that's what we were concerned about as a market as a whole. Shift a little bit to the business interruption side, but now we're starting to look at how are you responding to an event and are you responding appropriately? Most recently, we saw that the OFAC in the US had now dished out another reminder that you're not supposed to be paying any type of ransomware or anything from a financial institution or an insurance company to a sanctioned country. But the idea from a ransomware side is you don't know it's sanctioned until afterwards. And businesses aren't going to be staying down for 30 days to find out who is actually demanding of the money and going through that appropriate measure. So I think in answering your question directly is the market shifted in two ways. It's how they're actually looking at the underwriting process and how they're looking at organizations and their response, but also how they're going to respond to it as well, and taking note of that OFAC reminder that sanctioned countries on the ransomware side of things is actually going to make a big difference in whether they can or cannot pay it in some cases.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's also a kind of a cyber risk maturity that many businesses are taking in their approach to how they buy their cyber insurance. So, how are you seeing businesses really change their approach to their cyber placements in today's environment?
Well, I think this is the good part about the shift in the market, is actually shifting our clients in the way that they look at this, particularly in the retail food and beverage side of things. We start to see that they're starting to assess their actual risks and exposures in a better and more meaningful way, which helps them to actually then procure the right risk transfer side of things too. So when we start looking at not just the privacy side, but we look at the business interruption, but then we also look at the segmentation. So if something were to happen to one computer in one area, or one computer system in one particular region, is that going to affect the rest of the organization for a multinational organization? The same could be said too of different parts within the same warehouse. Is one system going to affect the other? This is a big part of what we were looking at from the underwriting side 5 years ago. And it kind of dissipated as we started to get into the business interruption, and ransomware started really ramping up about 2-3 years ago. But now it's starting to come back. The idea that, is one system going to bring down the entire system, or is there a way to segment that?
Sure. And any tips to share on how businesses can really quantify these new exposures? Because it's such a kind of a rapidly changing environment, but it's really pivotal that businesses really do kind of change their placements.
Yeah, and this is one thing that, admittedly, we still struggle in terms of advising our clients in the proper way, but we should be looking at multiple different models. You can't just take one model and take it to heart and say that this is the true, crystal ball. This is going to tell you your exposures. You should buy the limits at this amount. Get multiple different samplings. When we look at the basis of peer benchmarking, we don't take two peers and say, okay, they're buying, 100 million in limits. That's what we're going to buy. No, we look at 10 plus peers. The same should be going for quantifying your cyber risks. You can look at the quantification models with your brokers, third parties, vendors that would be going through your brokers. It's the way that you would want to just look at multiple different numbers. At Marsh in the cyber team in the UK, we actually look at 6 different models to come up with the right limits that should be purchased. And we then have to quantify that against other further deeper quantification processes through our Marsh advisory side of things. So what we're doing is taking about 6 to 8 different samplings to come up with the right suggestion on limits, retention. And then if we want to go even further, we can go outside of the cyber market, which I'm not going to pretend to be an expert. But if you look at the quantification of all your insurance against that, what is your major risk that you should be looking at? So what we're doing really is taking multiple different samples to come up with that suggestion.
Sure, and I think we've discussed this before, Brian. Benchmarking's is a data point, but when many businesses really are buying to their full exposure, they're actually buying a limit that they've whether it's a budget constraint or they're just looking to buy a low limit to start with. I think that's where benchmarking can often be a bit of an outlier.
And just to add on to that, David, that's a great point. We look at the budget constraints that are occurring right now in the economy that we're seeing in the world. And I think when we look at insurance, cyber has about 14 or 15 different parts to it. So when you look at quantifying it, your privacy risk versus your business interruption risk may be different. So does that mean that you need to buy the same amount of limits on let's say business interruption is quanting out at 100 million in risk, but your privacy risk is looking at 50 million? Do you need to buy privacy at 100 million? No. Maybe you separate it and just buy the business interruption up to 100 million. And your privacy risk, you would buy the risk transfer up to 50 million. There might be some type of savings in doing this quantification just by knowing that you're over-insuring other parts of the business. Now, getting into the complications of separating those two out and how that all works, that's where the brokers have to come in and help you out a little bit more.
Sure. I mean, that's a great point, getting that differentiated, a program within a program. And that's going to enable clients to become have a more efficient purchase. So it's making better use of their premium spend, and it's also aligning them to their exposure, which is one of my key themes at the moment. I'm just wondering how the market's responding to these high limits. Just give us a view on what the capacity is as well within the UK and international markets.
Yeah, so the capacity, we're seeing it shift right now to slightly lowering, but not in a concerning way. So if we look at the limits of 50 million chunks or 25 million chunks, those are starting to go away. They're not saying that they're not going to put up that amount. If we look at particular carriers such as Munich Re, Beazley, AIG, that would be able to put up those large tranches, they're starting to go down to the 10s, the 25s, or in some cases just 10s, but they are looking for more ventilated limits to put up. So they will be able to put up in some cases up to 50 million, but across multiple layers, typically with 50 to 100 million spacing. So if you look at a primary with XYZ carrier at 10 million, they might want to put the next 10 million at excess of 100 million or excess of 50 million. So the capacity hasn't really changed as much. We have seen a lot of shifts, and it's not a surprise, in the MGA side of things, where the capacity is actually lowered to a slightly concerning, but it's not impacting our overall capacity. So to give you a straight number, we're still looking at about USD 500 million in capacity in the cyber market. And we also have access to the Bermudian market, which is about 50 million. So we have over 500 million still in capacity, and we still place towers that are looking at 500 million plus in the cyber market through the UK. Now, the international, we are seeing more local markets start to drum up outside of the UK, which is great to see, because that's hugely supportive of us in the UK and Lloyd's being in access to the local markets, as we've been doing with the US for over a decade now.
Right, and I guess the next question, the killer question around markets, would be on pricing. Everyone's kind of wants to know. So what are the trends at the moment?
The pricing trends varies. So one of the key things that we're hearing from the markets, and we've had several in-depth conversations, even going down to looking at their book where they would open it up to us, is the loss ratios versus the actual premium that's coming in. And this can be split up into multiple different areas. As a whole, right now, we're seeing an increase in the market of just over 10% from what we saw after Q3, creeping into close to 15% increases. Now, when we go through the reinsurance treaty negotiations that are happening in Q4, this may shift in one way or the other. My guess is that it's going to shift slightly upwards. What we saw from the loss ratios versus the premium as a whole for Lloyd's is Lloyd's has roughly about $1 billion in premium that's placed right now, and this is GBP. And if we were to look at what is actually being lost, is that they're running at a cost of risk around roughly 120%. If this were to go into the trends going to 2021, they're going to operate around 140, 150% cost of risk, which may wipe out all the profits over the last 6 years. We don't want that. So as a community in a market with the brokers, we have to make sure that we're getting the right price out there, that we can have this as a sustainable market, but also having our conversations with our clients early on to help them plan from the budget side of things, which we mentioned a little bit earlier. So pricing is changing, it's shifting. We're no longer in a firming market. I'd say that we're in a hardening market right now for cyber, with the idea that there's going to be more analysis done in the next 3 to 4 months to understand what's going to happen there.
Yeah, and that would countenance my sense, particularly with a lot of those losses coming into the market around the ransomware that you mentioned before. And also a key thing we've discussed before is almost like the professionalization of underwriting again, going into some of the key underwriting data. So what can clients expect now regarding the data they're going to have to provide for a cyber renewal versus what they may have had to produce a year or so ago?
Yeah, and I think we're seeing more of this shift in what we would call the middle market, or annual turnover of $1 billion or less, where the questions previously were roughly around 20 to 50 questions. In some cases, you might be able to get away with 6 questions in the SME space, which is we're looking at 150 million and below in annual turnover. But now we're seeing up to 100, 150 questions being requested, because the middle market space was actually getting hit harder when you look at the loss ratios versus the premium that's actually coming in. The premiums are obviously a lot cheaper than the large organizations or multinational organizations. So with the questions that are being asked, it's going mainly around ransomware. It's no question that this is where the losses are occurring in the middle market space. But I would say that it's great that we're seeing a lot of our clients happy to fill out even our Marsh Cyber Self-Assessment proprietary form, which has over 300 questions. And that's tailored to the NIST framework, which is a framework that most IT parts of the organization actually utilize. So there's a joint up of that quantification we were talking about earlier, as well as the additional questions that are being asked. So it's getting a little bit more granular. To answer the question directly, is those types of segmentation, information, incident response, all those type of things are starting to come into play more in the corporate space. Now, if we look at the large organizations, they're starting to get into that breakdown by regions. We all know that every region in a multinational organization is a little bit different because you have different laws, different privacy laws. You also have different setups. You have different languages and cultures that actually adhere to that. What we're trying to get into now and what we're seeing the markets ask for is that granular information. So how is your system set up in, let's say, South Korea versus the UK versus the US? And how does that differ? How are they connected? What does it look like? We're not yet at the point where we're seeing forensic investigators come on site, which we know that in the US, they were looking at that for utilities. About 5-6 years ago, they were starting to do that through a couple of insurers. But we are getting into the point where questions of over 300 is the norm. And that's fine because that actually helps price accordingly and also helps quantify, going back to that key part of the actual risk transfer process.
Yeah, that's where we're certainly seeing certain claims caused by what I would call international actors. And certainly for global firms, they're looking to find the weakest point in a global firm's kind of overall system. So kind of regardless of where head office is domiciled, these actors are smart enough to work out where the weak point is, and they're going to go in wherever that may be to try and exploit that weakness. Yeah. So I just wondered what your kind of crystal ball moment, on claims, what are the kind of scenarios that we probably could be seeing next? Any tips on that?
Yeah, I think ransomware is still going to dominate the headlines for the next 6 to 12 months, especially since we're all living in a virtual world at this point. So we're all connecting to the weak points, as you were saying, David, is sometimes our routers, our home internet, everything else is becoming a new access point for the third-party bad actors. From a claim standpoint, I think with the shifting in how the market's looking at ransomware and starting to discuss, what's the coverage going to look like in 2021? Is there going to be some type of co-insurance? Is there going to be some type of supplement? Is the excess going to cover any type of demands? We're going to start seeing the claims start to shift slightly because of the changing market in that respect. But we're going to see business interruption. If I had to focus on one thing, business interruption and digital supply chain will be a large claim area because we're going to start to see subrogation against third parties, which is going to also, not to jump out of the cyber market, but jump into the tech E&O side of things, where these technology companies buy this professional service E&O coverage. And if the subrogation falls to them, not mitigating some type of loss or some type of penetration through the cybersecurity of an organization, we're going to see those claims and those business interruption claims start to shift over to that space as well. That's very much on the theme we started with. I'm still fixated with this risk around automation, and it's kind of, in a way, hearing that really countenances a lot of the conversations we'll be having, and supports me in the conversations we'll be having with clients and prospects around that exposure. It's something they've really got to start focusing on. I'm just wondering how, kind of a final wrap-up question, just wondering how the cyber market's responding coverage-wise. Any changes to the kind of the proprietary wordings we're using now? So no changes directly right now, but I hinted at it a little bit in terms of what's coming on the ransomware side. When we start talking about creating a sustainable market to make sure that we're covering all types of risks, I think we'll see a slight change in the way that ransomware is being addressed by the markets. And at this point, we're seeing it market by market, having different ideas. I talked about the co-insurance of ransomware demands or ransomware in general, the sublimiting of ransom in itself. But other coverages, we haven't seen a big change yet. Before, we were talking about the war exclusion at the beginning of the year. My understanding, having talked to some people in the Lloyd's committee that's working on that this is coming close to a decision, which is good because we'll have a clear-cut understanding of what that coverage or that exclusion in particular has. But then also we have to think about the silent cyber and how that's starting to change for what's going to happen in the cyber market. So the traditional lines that have this cyber coverage or this silent cyber coverage in there has changed a lot since Lloyd's had the PRA mandate in terms of taking out that cyber coverage. So now it's shifting over to our market, and one in particular that for the retail food and beverage is the property damage side. And that also goes for not only them, but also their supply chains, going back to that key part of the risk that happens for a lot of organizations in this industry.
Right. So to wrap up, a really big thank you to Brian. I think really insightful advice and perspectives there. We touched on claims, trends around limits, the way the market's reacting, lots of things for clients to absorb, but great direction on that. Thank you, Brian. And we look forward to welcoming you to the next audio cast. That will focus on business forecasting and key trends. And it will feature a leading expert from Oliver Wyman, so bringing a different perspective to the audio series. And we look forward to welcoming you to that. Take care.